Welcome back to all of you who are our regular attenders to these talks. It's good to have you back. And anyone who's new to our talks, you're obviously also very welcome. We see quite a few new faces every week, and this is in part because we're sort of deliberately trying to have a variety of talks. Some of you will be here specifically for the talk today, but be assured you're welcome here every week to hear about the broad range of energy topics that we're discussing as part of this seminar. The format of the talk is that we'll hear from Tim for 40 to 50 minutes-ish. And if you have any questions throughout the talk, just put them in the chat and we'll go through questions at the end, and you're very welcome to then turn your camera and your microphone on and ask the questions yourself. The other ask is that if you would like to write about today's topic, you are encouraged to do so, all the bloggers among you, and would love to hear from you. Write a summary of the talk, what you liked about it, what you thought about it, and it would go up on the energy.ox.ac.uk website, which is a claim to fame for yourself if you like to be published. Now, as I said, we've got quite a wide range of topics, but what they all have in common is they touch in some way on our transition towards low carbon, and they're delivered by excellent speakers, experts in their field, and today is no exception. Tim meets both those criteria. Anyone who listens to the Today program will know about him. For everyone else, Tim is our Professor of Transport Studies and also the Director of the Transport Studies Unit. And the topic he touches on today is one that we've actually covered several times, at least the transport part, but usually through the lens of technology, electric vehicles, vehicle to grid, all those sort of technical sides of how we can change mobility. And I'm therefore especially pleased that in the spirit of our talks today, we get a slightly different but incredibly important perspective on how that transition can be conducted in a just manner. And who better to talk about that than our very own Professor Tim Schwanen. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip, for this generous introduction, and hello, everyone, wherever you are. As Phyllis said, I'm going to talk about just transitions to low carbon mobility. And it will come as no surprise when I start by saying that transport systems are in flux all over the world, with multiple trends playing out simultaneously and interacting in different geographical contexts in different ways. And you can sort of try to visualize that flux in many different ways. But one way is to look at the outlooks on the future of transport at the global level, like the one that BP produces every year. I always quite like BP's outlook because it is what I like to think of as in the middle range. It's not over optimistic. It's also not too cautious. These graphs are from the 2020 document. It was published a couple of months ago, and shows whatever sort of under different scenarios an increase in the absolute amount of energy consumed in transport by up to a third in the period up to 2050. But we see a significant shift away from oil towards, first of all, electric, and to a lesser extent, biofuels and hydrogen. Actually, this is a point BP always makes. The biggest changes are from increases in energy efficiency of cars, rather than shifts to other modes of transport. Although one thing that's new in this year's outlook is the strong emphasis placed on robotaxis and shared autonomous taxis. I'm not sure I quite believe their optimism, but it's interesting. And I think what this graph and many like it show is that rapid electrification and somewhat slower automation are now widely seen as inevitable. And we see this pattern being replicated time and again at different geographical scales, globally, like here, continentally, nationally, locally. In countries like the UK, regions like Oxfordshire, we see government and other actors articulating the need to support electrification in particular. And at TSU, the research center around privilege to lead has actually benefited from this in a number of ways, because it has brought research projects to us. But I do remain concerned nonetheless, because the focus of policy, academic and public discourse is on the need to accelerate the transition away from oil-powered transport, and to do so as efficiently as possible, ideally through voluntary change with a minimum of command and control policies. But what about justice in all of this? I think that question is not often enough asked. And that question in turn opens up a host of all other questions. What does justice actually mean in relation to a shift away from carbon-intensive transport? And how can we as academics think about just transitions in the specific context of transport? There's a broad discourse on just transitions in energy, but to what extent this is relevant to the transport sector is something we need to reflect upon. And finally, how are just transitions in transport to be brought about in different geographical contexts? Now, I want to reflect on some of these questions today, and in so doing, I will be focusing primarily on the everyday urban mobility of people, and will not talk about aviation, maritime, or freight. There will be quite a bit of talk about electrification and to a certain extent cycling, walking, because these are the modes of transport, the forms of transport that have significant momentum across much of the planet. And what I will be doing is talk a little bit about how we've been thinking about justice in relation to transport and mobility, then talk a little bit about just transitions in the energy field, think about what all of this means for our thinking about just transitions in the low carbon mobility field, and finally come up with some conclusions. It's fair to say that the literature on justice in transport and mobility has exploded the last 5 to 8 years. And this is a recent piece that Cecilia Verlinghieri in the Transport Studies Unit and myself have published, in which we try to provide an overview of that literature. I won't cover everything. I just want to limit myself to 6 observations. Firstly, that literature is dispersed across many different disciplines and epistemic communities, from civil engineering and quantitative geography to urban planning and to qualitative sociology and anthropology. Questions of justice are hot in relation to transport and mobility. And the majority of the work across all these transitions remains focused on questions of equity and distributive justice. This is easily understandable because almost all transport systems entail an uneven distribution of benefits and harms. However, I think this also means a narrow and often rather static understanding of what justice entails in relation to transport. And within this focus on distribution, attention is directed to both actual mobility, what people do, what we can observe, and to a lesser extent, the lived experience of that behavior, and on potential behavior, which is accessibility and capabilities. Accessibility is the traditional way transport researchers, geographers have been analyzing potential behavior. And it's a very powerful way. There are many different accessibility measures you can think of. This is from a recent study done in Toronto, which is about the number of jobs you can reach within a certain travel time threshold, a very efficient way of showing potential mobility. Capabilities have been are increasingly used as well, building on the work of Amartya Sen. And interestingly, the capabilities concept is used across all of these different fields. So it's people in engineering who write about capabilities, but also qualitative sociologists. And I think that's a really interesting observation. That means that there is something in the potential of this concept of capability that can unify some of the quite broad and diverse discourses around justice in transport. Now, forms of justice beyond just distribution are attracting increased attention as well in the transport literature. And we see some interest in procedural justice, in justice as recognition, and in epistemic justice. And you can see what these terms mean on this slide. I would say, though, that there is a need for more work on all three of these forms of justice. Interestingly, it is more and more common to draw a distinction between transport and mobility justice. And this is particularly since the publication of the book here, Mobility Justice, by Mimi Scheller, in which she understands mobility justice as an amalgamation of transport, environmental, and climate justice. And she grounds her analysis in what she calls a mobile ontology, in which movement is seen as primordial to meaning, value, power, and subject formation. And she argues that we need to really look at multiple spatial and temporal scales if we want to understand mobility justice. And she argues for analysis that look at the interconnections between processes at the scales of the body as the site where uneven access and capabilities are created, the street, the city, the nation state, and the planet. And it's the planet, of course, where increasingly processes of urbanization, resource extraction, and the accumulation of greenhouse gases plays out. Now, Scheller's conceptualization and research building on it comes closest to thinking about just transitions, I would argue. And it is here that I think we can make an interesting link to the broader work on just transitions. The concept of just transition goes back to the 1970s, was actually coined by unionists in the US who were protesting specific types of environmental regulation at the time. And the concept has seen a wide sort of significant development and diversification since the 1990s. Despite all these differences, it's the relationship between development and energy demand and climate change that are at the heart of this concept. And just transitions is a framework that holds that equity and justice should be seen as an integral part of the transition to a low carbon world. Much work in this field is focused on the how question, how to achieve a just transition. And research on this topic comes from many different disciplines and epistemic communities. Now, the Just Transition Research Collective has classified this work on how to achieve just transitions into 4 categories, which they associate with particular worldviews. You have, on the one hand, status quo approaches that advocate a greening of capitalism, which is to be achieved without significant change to the institutions that underpin capitalism. So it's voluntary, corporate, and market-driven initiatives that are involved here. And the focus is typically on distributive justice. In managerial reform approaches, changes created again within the prevailing system, but with minor changes to the formal and informal institutions. Though you could say the architecture, the basic architecture of the political economy remains intact, and the focus again is on distributive justice. In structural reform approaches, there's considerable institutional change, structural reform with a focus towards more collective ownership and different governance and decision-making structures. So we see a focus here also on participatory, on procedural justice, in addition to questions of distributive justice. And finally, transformative approaches are the most radical. There's deep change of the political and economic systems, and the preoccupation with economic growth is being challenged. Systems of oppression rooted in gender, sexuality, race, and class are being dismantled, and human-environment relationships are being configured in new ways. So the focus here is on distributive procedural justice as well as justice as recognition. I find this classification quite helpful, and it can be used for thinking about urban transport and mobility as well. However, it is also only one of the ways in which you can think about just transitions in the energy domain. And there's a wide range of other approaches that also focus on justice in terms of distribution, procedure, and recognition. And sometimes more dimensions are added. This is from a recent paper by Benjamin Sovacool and his team, where they also identify what they call cosmopolitan justice, which is about the protection of global human rights and global externalities, which they separate out from recognition, which I think has the advantage of bringing at least some of the spatial dynamics in the planetary scale that I mentioned before when I discussed the work of Mimi Scheller. I think this is particularly useful in the context of electric mobility, where this is important for thinking about the extraction of scarce resources and metals that are required for EV batteries. Think of the cobalt that is typically mined in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where 60% of the known resources are located. Think also about lithium in what is known as the lithium triangle of Argentina, Chile, and Colombia, or Lake Tabuya in Tibet. All of these are regions where political instability and geopolitical conflict are ongoing concerns. And the research, the resource extraction, the extra extraction that is required for to satisfy the demand for electric vehicles may complicate and exacerbate some of these instabilities and potential conflicts. Now, there's also a range of other frameworks for trying to enhance justice in transitions. And these are informed by different theoretical traditions. There's work that goes back to liberal political theory, but there's also neo-Marxist work that I think is very interesting to engage with. Significant further theoretical and conceptual work is nonetheless required when we think about just transitions in the energy domain and in the transport domain. And I think there are a number of questions that really need to be addressed, and they're very difficult issues to address, but I think they're important nonetheless. We need to think, for instance, about whether our understandings of justice need to be general or whether they need to be domain specific. So should the focus be on frameworks that can be applied across domains, or rather so many particularities and salient aspects to a domain like urban transport that they warrant their own perspectives? And what's the advantage? What are the advantages and disadvantages of each of these two options? There's also the question about whether we should focus on humans alone, and what to do with the modern human world. Of course, we wouldn't want to lump all non-human agents and elements in the world together, but we can ask whether non-humans require some form of recognition, if not participation, when we think about justice. There's also the question about how independent our understandings of justice are from the processes that we're looking at. Forgive me the brief excursion into philosophy and that of Plato in particular in this third point on this slide, but I can't really think of a better way of drawing attention to the question of whether understandings of justice are like natural laws in the imagination of Galileo and Newton, which means they're outside space and time, or whether they are, in the words of someone like Alfred North Whitehead, dependent on their epoch and upon the forms of process dominant in that epoch. I don't think this question is often asked, how independent or dependent our concept of justice are on space and time. But if we're thinking about transitions, particularly wholesale changes of prevailing systems of provision, then I think this is a very relevant question to ask. There's also finally the question about culture specificity, which is in a way related to the previous question, but it comes with a twist. Justice as discussed so far is predominantly a concern of academics in Northern and Western institutions. And if we accept that all forms of knowledge are situated in the way someone like Donna Haraway would suggest, then any conceptualization of justice is shaped by the positionality of the people who formulate these conceptualizations. So this raises the question of how epistemically just prevailing conceptions of justice are in relation to energy transports and transitions, and whether we should really think about making these in some way culturally specific. But perhaps there's enough of common grounds shared by cultures and place-specific modes of thinking that we can get away and with universal perspectives. Now, I may have raised expectations with these questions that I will not be able to meet because I don't have answers necessarily, but I do think we need to think very critically about these questions. My inclination, for what it's worth, is that we really need to be leaning towards humility, and that we may need domain-specific understandings of justice, that we need to do more to recognize the more than human, that we need fluid, malleable, context-specific understandings of justice, and that we do need to think seriously about the need to decolonize our understandings of justice. All of this means that I will not be able to offer you a rounded or definitive perspective on just transitions towards low carbon mobility, from I am too situate in all kinds of social and spatial relationships and specificities. But it does not mean that we have to succumb to a form of relativism in which any perspective is as good as any other. Nor does this mean that we need to ignore perspectives that privilege generality, anthropocentrism, and or universality. I think we can learn a lot from all of these, and I will try to sort of adopt a synthesizing attitude and diverge where I think that is useful. And the way I want to do that is by offering sort of four propositions about how we might think about just transitions in relation to low carbon mobility, where the term proposition is not meant as a statement that claims to be true, but more as as something that allows other people to think in a slightly different way. So it is literally a proposition. And the first of these is that I think we should be very careful with and very wary of our Euro-American fascination with the new. I am very sympathetic to and excited by the numerous studies on who will benefit from new technologies or institutional arrangements, whether we're talking about electric vehicles, bus rapid transit, ride-hailing, shared mobility schemes. But I'm also interested in those who are left behind. And here I'm thinking of those who are unable to access and use those kinds of schemes, and those who are dependent on high carbon mobility, the employees and their families in the oil sector, car manufacturing and selling, retail and hotel businesses premised on access, buy and availability of private cars, and so on. And researchers' attention, certainly in relation to mobility, is usually biased towards new technologies and new schemes.
Yeah, I got bumped out for some reason. Now I'm back.
I think that is in many ways a version of a broader fascination with the new that is so common in our culture. And the importance of also considering the people who are unable to use those schemes and dependent on high carbon mobility is very important. This follows not only from the literature on just energy transitions that I've just mentioned, but also the work of John Urry and colleagues on what they called the system of automobilities in the early mid-2000s, in which they assert that the significance of the privately owned car extends far beyond transportation and is critical to the wider economy, culture, the creation of subjectivities and the geopolitics of oil. So this means that the issues here go beyond the adoption or non-adoption of alternatives to the privately owned oil-powered car, and also the direct consequences this mobility has for people's everyday activities and practices. At stake are also all kinds of indirect and secondary effects. In the UK context, for instance, there are questions to be asked about what a diminished vehicle and fuel tax base with a rapid, there are questions to be asked about what the consequences are of a rapidly diminishing vehicle and fuel tax base are when we transition to electric vehicles. Who will be affected by the diminishing revenues for government from the taxation of oil-powered vehicle purchase and use? And also, what if at some point in the future driving an oil-powered vehicle becomes a source of social stigmatization? When we already know when it's usually the low-income households that are disproportionately driving older and dirtier cars. And when we start thinking about what seems to be a fair policy, like a polluter pay principle, is that really fair when we take into consideration that it's usually the poor who drive older, dirtier vehicles? And if we're talking about these kinds of things, will the voices of drivers of oil-powered vehicles be recognized, and will they be able to make a difference in the political domain? Now, these questions are currently a little far-fetched, but I think in the near future, we really need to start thinking about these. And we need to, I think there's a research agenda about vehicular mobility injustices opening up that deserves significant attention alongside all the work that focuses on who benefits from newer forms of mobility. The second proposition is about, you can see here, if justice in terms of distribution, participation, and recognition is to be more than an add-on element, then I think we really need to take serious transformative approaches to transitions in the way that I've just described them. Most approaches to low carbon mobility, most approaches to a low carbon transition in urban transport can be classified as status quo or managerial reform approaches according to the scheme I just presented, where the focus is on voluntary changes in the kinds of vehicles people acquire or the transport modes they use, and where the emphasis is on measures that try to persuade people by providing them certain information or through marketing, or where the emphasis is on changes in physical infrastructures, whether that's a segregated bike lane or an EV charging infrastructure. And finally, the third set of elements here are economic instruments like subsidies, whether that's a tax incentive for an EV or a free public transport pass. The point is that transition here is understood narrowly in terms of shifts in quantitative output measures that effectively function as KPIs. Kilometers traveled, modal shares, greenhouse gas emissions, air pollution levels, charging points per capita, kilometers of bike lane, and so on and so forth. And this form of thinking about change is linked reciprocally to a set of rationalities that revolve around the maximization of efficiency, cost effectiveness, political and public acceptability. Now, questions of justice can and do feature in these kinds of approaches, but are typically about distributional issues, and the focus is on downstream forms of participation like consultation or referendums. The point is that they're always at risk of being superseded by concerns about effectiveness and efficiencies. And much of this has to do with the historically emerged, quite top-down approaches to how transport is governed. And these approaches are dependent on knowledges from the realms of mathematics, engineering, econometrics, economics, and increasingly the data sciences. They also depend on metaphors that couch transport in terms of free flow circulation, speed, and efficient networks. And they understand transport typically in terms of instrumental value as a facilitator of economic growth and individual flourishing, or as a site where symbols of progress and governmental legitimacy can be created through infrastructure development. But there's very little intrinsic value to movement. So in this kind of approach, which I would say is this is very broad brush, of course, but this is the approach. These are the approaches that dominate transport policy, particularly in countries like the UK. We get a narrow understanding of justice, and that is always at risk of being superseded by something else. It's interesting to see that certainly in the UK, I would argue that structural reform approaches to transition or to change are quite underdeveloped. There are flickerings of fragments, really, as in Labour's politically expedient calls to nationalize the railways, or the experimentation with climate assemblies in recent years, first at the local level, including in Oxford, and earlier this calendar year at the national level. And I think these climate assemblies are a really interesting thing from a procedural justice point of view, because they have repeatedly foregrounded a stronger focus than policy on questions of distributive justice. And this is admittedly only one set of recommendations about transport that the Climate Assembly UK made in its final report, but you can see that questions about distribution feature quite prominently. Ensure solutions are accessible and affordable to all sections of society is quite a powerful statement to see in a document like this. So I'm very interested in this whole climate assembly experimentation, though I'm a little bit skeptical, at least at the moment, about their efficacy in bringing about genuine change. One of the reasons why structural reform approaches in the UK context are limited lies in the deep institutional lock-in in the historically emerged apparatuses for the governing of transport. And I think even in places where what could be considered to be more enlightened approaches to changing urban transport, like London, Brighton, indeed Oxford, users of transport systems, including the most vulnerable, remain understood primarily through figures like Homo economicus, whether that is in its neoclassical or its behavioral economics versions. And I think this is also why governmental approaches like transition management, which are making some headway in countries like the Netherlands, remain institutionally incompatible with the way transport is governed in the UK. Transport management, as developed by people like Derek Lorbeck, is not without its criticisms, because it can be captured by vested interests, but I do believe has the potential to offer greater distributional and procedural justice in the transport realm. And I would really like to see more take-up of that and more experimentation with this approach in the UK. Perhaps, though, we need to expect the biggest gains, benefits from in terms of justice in transitions towards low carbon mobility to come from transformative approaches, not just in the UK, globally. Our research at the TSU suggests these transformative approaches exist and they flourish, and they develop in what transition scholars call niches. Think of community-based car sharing schemes. Top left is North Oxford, where we had an e-car club Think also of all sorts of activities around cycling and walking, like bike maintenance workshops and community-based cycling competency schemes, group schemes for walking, jogging, or cycling together, and initiatives to create do-it-yourself, do-it-together infrastructures, like you see bottom right. This is from Sao Paulo, one of the locations we've been doing research, where these are actually very common, unlike the UK, and where this is really about the reappropriation of street space. And it's really about asserting a right to mobility, a right to the city for pedestrians and other forms of slower transport. Initiatives of this kind are often limited in scale, temporally intermittent, meaning they're not always active. They're haunted by financial challenges and often struggle to find qualified staff and volunteers, which means that scaling them is challenging, though not impossible. But sometimes this is also not what is really the point here, because doing so would almost certainly dilute their strengths and efficacy. It appears that most of their wider impacts are indirect by changing how, through the way they change the actions and strategies of other actors that copy some of their schemes and initiatives. And we've done some very interesting research on this in London. I'm very happy to talk about that later in the Q&A. But these transformative initiatives are interesting from a justice point of view for multiple reasons. For one, they're not concerned only with distributive justice. They practice a much more participatory decision-making approach, and they're finely attuned to questions of justice as recognition. And we can see that in a range of different ways. We can see that here, for instance, on this slide, bottom left, is from a scheme in London that is tailored to migrants from non-Western origins whose legal status may not always be entirely clear, but for whom cycling is literally liberating because it allows them to explore the city, to gain a level of independence that they've never had. And what these schemes do, this scheme at least does, is it provides both cycling training and it's workshops where people can build their own bikes from donated bikes and bike parts. So these schemes are uniquely tailored to specific needs, requirements, and skill levels. A second reason why justice is so central and to these schemes is, and why it is so important to their development, is that the understandings of justice and the visions of a better future that inform these initiatives are often quite flexible. In our interviews with leaders of the kinds of schemes that you see on this slide, we can see a wide range of fluid notions of what justice entails and means to them over the life course of the organization they ran and the initiatives they were responsible for. And it is also here that we see really different versions of justice, where people are actually talking about more than human justice, for instance. So there are little spaces within the transport realm where these kinds of philosophical questions I raised earlier are being taken up. A deeper engagement with multiple notions of transport-related justice exists outside the mainstream, therefore. There is some merit to the argument that when push comes to shove, the transformative initiatives to transitions like the ones I've just discussed will make at best a dent in moving towards a low carbon transport future. But this is also missing a point. The transition challenge in transport cannot be reduced to a managerial focus on tons of CO2 equivalent emissions saved. It's about governing, organizing, and shaping transport in different ways compared to what has been inherited. And even more importantly, it is not primarily about transport per se. It is also about how society is organized more generally. It's about poor health and insecurity. It's about socioeconomic inequalities, and it's about limited opportunities to craft a decent life within a legal economy. It's also about how large parts of cities in their public realm have become inhospitable to many places. So transport often is not really what is at the heart of these initiatives. It's about transport and energy in a broader set of issues that people are concerned about. And I think that's a real strength and a strong driver for positive change. My third proposition is that the concept of capabilities is a useful starting point for thinking about just transitions in mobility, but it needs to be rethought as a concept. There's something really powerful to the notion originally developed by Amartya Sen. But I think we should move beyond this or develop it in three ways. I think it is useful to think about capabilities beyond questions of distribution. The capabilities to access transport infrastructures, to develop and cultivate the skills to cycle or charge your EV competently, and finally, to actually do this and afterwards legitimize and rationalize the decisions you've taken are very important indeed. And we need to think about those very carefully. But there is no reason why the concept of capability should be limited to the domain of distributional justice. It can be extended to the capability to participate in governance and decision making, to make one's voice heard, either directly or indirectly via one or more spokespersons. It's also about the capability to articulate one's needs, values, habits in a way that is commensurable with the discourse of academic research, policymakers, service providers, and other actors. And this is where justice as recognition and epistemic justice start to intersect. We should also be thinking about capabilities as entangled. Much of the potential of capability approaches is negated by embedding them in a narrow individualist mode of thinking, where the focus is just on how we can enhance the capabilities of a given person. But this is to misrecognize the entangled nature of capabilities. I tend to explain this point to students with reference to SUVs and cyclists. And I must admit that this example is partly shaped by my own experience of navigating Oxford Street on a bicycle. An SUV is in many ways a wonderful artifact because it enhances the potential actions and states of being of those on the inside because of the oversight, the security, and the sense of constraints, alongside the spaciousness and convenience it provides relative to many other ways of moving through the city. At the same time, however, that SUV diminishes the capabilities or risks diminishing the capabilities of people outside the vehicle, both near and far and over different timescales. Because of the amount of space SUVs take up and the visibility their design affords, they often diminish they often enhance risks for cyclists and diminish their capabilities in that particular moment of encounter. Of course, these effects become more serious as the number of SUVs increase, and especially if they become the dominant mode of provision for private vehicles. And I would like to remind you in this case that this is one of the most rapidly growing segments of vehicles. And I think Gillian Annabel, Christian Brandt have not too long ago shown that for every EV that is sold in this country, there are 37 SUVs sold or new onto the road. And because of their design and weight, they demand more fossil fuel than smaller cars. And this is all in spite of the gains in vehicle efficiency that have been made and that continue to be made. And this pollution and emission burden that these vehicles create is not insignificant. And they may have effects, however marginal, on the capabilities of people in locations across the planet where people are at particular risk of climate-related hazards. Think of the eastern coast of the Philippines, which is one location where I'm involved in field work at the moment, or parts of Florida, where it is the poor, in most cases, who bear the brunt of extreme weather events that, if not directly caused by anthropogenic climate change, at least to some extent are intensified by transport's thirst for oil. The third way in which we should rethink capabilities is in terms of how we value them. And I would suggest that we try to value them in terms of the futures across spatial and temporal scales that they open up. This point follows from the previous points, but interestingly also opens up a pathway towards quantification and policy evaluation. I must admit I'm currently not clear on how we should do this, and this is something I want to be working on in the research that we're doing. But framing the valuation questions in the terms of futures that are opened up has, I think, two sets of advantages. It helps us to think about the entangled nature of capabilities, and rather than thinking about individuals in isolation from one another. And it explicitly poses questions about the future of mobility in normative terms. It forces whoever is engaging in valuation to ask fundamental questions about what future we want or desire for our mobility system and why. And I think that is really important to ask this kind of questions, because in transport planning, in the discussions about transport, the question is often about how can we do X, Y, or Z, less so about why we would want to do something. And this way we can start having that extra level of reflexivity in our thinking about transport futures. Final proposition is that epistemic justice should really be placed at the heart of thinking about just transitions in mobility. It becomes much easier to act on the suggestions put forward in the first three propositions if we can be confident that the knowledges that we have are robust and sufficiently sensitive to time, place, and culture. And I think this places a particular obligation on academic researchers in relation to just transitions. For the way I see it, it is perhaps our responsibility to guard the knowledges that feed into transition, to ensure that the knowledges that feed into transition processes are epistemically just. I showed this definition before once, but want to draw out the two elements Marinda Fricker has identified as testimonial justice and hermeneutical justice. The first raises important questions about research methods. Do they allow all relevant actors to make their voices heard? The second triggers a wealth of questions about how we as researchers make sense of what we hear, and thus leads back to the questions about theory, concepts, and underlying worldviews, as well as the questions about the philosophical issues about domain specificity, the more than human and cultural specificity. Ensuring testimonial justice does not necessarily mean using qualitative research methods like interviews or ethnography, but they do make this easier. Perhaps mixed method approaches and all kinds of digital methods are very helpful too. In fact, they are. I shouldn't say perhaps, I should say they are very helpful. It's not just qualitative methods, but relying only on traditional transport methods like trip diaries, or more recent ones like GPS traces and taps with smart cards. It's tricky when we want to be confident that the knowledges we create lead to greater justice. And what you see on this slide is an example from a project we did a couple of years ago at the TSU with Sam Hampton, Brendan Doody, where we were asked to evaluate the performance of 5 different types of installations for the on-street charging of electric vehicles for the city of Oxford. And at the time, there wasn't really a framework for thinking about how you would define successful performance from a user point of view. And of course, we could have gone and looked at the literature and come up with a set of criteria ourselves. But what we did instead was talk to people, interview people repeatedly. We filmed them making use of the installations at 2 points in time. And from that, we derived in a very bottom-up manner a set of criteria for identifying successful performance. Now, the end result, if you look at the left-hand side of the table here, is not dramatically different from what you or I could have come up with. But there are in the detail quite a number of things that we would not have thought about if we'd not sort of really taken the issue of testimonial justice serious. And I think we've been able to come up with a set of criteria that do that do really reflect some of the concerns and issues that people are dealing with on an everyday level when they are charging their vehicle. The other leg of epistemic justice is called hermeneutic. Hermeneutical justice, as I just mentioned, is really as important as testimonial justice, because you can have the most brilliant data. If you don't have the theoretical and conceptual tools to make sense of them, you won't get very far. Actually, my view is that the area of hermeneutical justice is where the bigger challenges lie, because of the historic legacy of how we think about transport. Systems thinking is wonderful, and so are the insights from economics and to a lesser extent, social psychology. However, systems thinking doesn't get you very far in terms of making sense about what different social groups and individuals have to offer in terms of knowledge. And the thinking from economics, at least neoclassical economics, behavioral economics, is really geared towards the average or representative human agent. And the same is true for most models from social psychology, at least models like the theory of planned behavior. There is then a real need for a wider range of ways to make sense of behavior or practices, as well as embodied experiences, understandings, values, and aspirations. Researchers like Mimi Scheller, who I mentioned before, and her colleagues working in a field that's known as mobilities, have offered such ways for almost 2 decades now. But their ideas not always travel that easily into the sides of policy making and corporate decision making. And even if it does, much of that work remains firmly grounded in Euro-American thinking about individuals, their practices, and their mental processes. And here too, more diversification is required. And for that, we probably need to look outwards. We need to look into other domains. And I think this is also where geographers, social scientists, working at the intersection of transport, energy, and transitions are uniquely well placed, because they can tap into developments that are unfolding in related areas. In our case, in geography, there's a lot of very exciting work in urban geography, in cultural geography, social geography that we can draw on and that we can use to enrich our understanding of people's behaviors and things like hermeneutic, and make sure that our analysis become hermeneutically more just. And through our collaborations with non-academic partners, whether these are in industry and the corporate sector, or whether they are in community organizations, grassroots organizations, we can disseminate some of these ideas and some of these practices. And I think that's a very important role that researchers like ourselves can play in the creation of just transitions in mobility. Let me conclude with 4 points. I think there's reason for optimism because there exists significant potential to achieve more just transitions towards low carbon mobility, especially, though not exclusively, outside the sites where policy gets made or corporate decisions are being made. This is where think of the grassroots actors whose activities I've briefly discussed. Think also of academics who are developing all kinds of exciting new methods and concepts. Think also, and this is very important, of the policymakers and entrepreneurs who are willing to experiment with doing things differently. I think in our thinking about just transitions, the focus should really be on distribution and participation and recognition and epistemic justice. Whatever we do, we will need to govern our transport systems in different ways. And if we do so, I think we can really capitalize on what I see as perhaps the biggest value of just mobility transition approaches. And that is that they allow questions over energy and carbon to be integrated with other major concerns over social equality, over well-being, over livability, over histories of oppression, including colonialism, and finally, our relation with the non-human worlds. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to your questions and the discussion.
Thank you very much, Tim. That was fantastic, and yeah, a high caliber discussion of theoretical frameworks that I'm sure will stimulate a great discussion. We've had comments in the chat already. I'm pleased to see that Pietro, talking of regulars, Pietro deserves a brass plaque as a participant in our energy colloquia. Always great to see you, Pietro. You had a question about the primary energy use right from the start. Do you want to pose your question directly to Tim?
Yeah, hi, Tim. Thanks very much for widening my view on these traffic-related problems. That's really good for me as a technical person. You said that the BP scenario is a middle way through, but I wonder, it says that the primary energy demand rises quite sharply with the transition to electrification, but actually there is much less electric energy needed for electric cars than there is fuel energy needed for petrol cars. So do you know the assumptions behind those graphs you showed at the beginning?
Yeah, I think in brief, actually one of the reasons why I like the BP scenarios is that they are quite cautious about the uptake of electrification. Their view remains, and this is that the extra demand for transport outside the global north is to a large extent going to be fulfilled by fossil fuel forms of transport. Not everyone will agree to that, but I think it's at least a very useful point to bear in mind. And basically, they're arguing the total growth in the demand for transport is going to be so big that the uptake of electrification is not going to be able to keep up with that. We will need oil-powered transport to satisfy a very large part of that additional demand. And that's the main reason for their figures.
Okay, so it's a very conservative view, because if we have a total electric transport in the UK, we would only need about 20% of more electric energy.
Yes.
Just, I mean, well, just relating to justice, such a scenario assumes that there is much, much more individual transport growing on the planet, isn't it?
Yes.
And
Yep.
Relating to justice, what you explained so nicely, is this a transition you really like, that we have more individual cars on the roads and then more countries?
No, of course not. But I think it's actually a pretty realistic, if very sobering, view. Then I think that there's a broader point here. There's the optimism about new technologies is very much shaped by our Western, our Euro-American experience. I think we'll see much, and these new technologies are not able on a global scale to keep up with the enormous growth in the absolute demand for transport that we see across Asia and Africa primarily, but also Latin America. Latin America is probably best placed for the majority of that extra demand being fulfilled with through electric propulsion. Other parts in the world, the situation is perhaps not that positive.
Okay, that's your assumption. Yeah, thank you.
At the same time, these are speculations. They're not predictions. And of course, BP, coming from a certain angle, having a certain legacy, they are less bullish in their expectations about electrification than other institutions that make these kinds of global outlooks. But I would not say they are certainly not the most conservative of the agencies that make this kind of prediction.
Yeah, sure.
We've got a few people in the audience who probably would be slightly more bullish in what we can do with electricity, but that's a good discussion to have.
Absolutely.
And we've so Kate has posted a question while Tim was answering, and I invite everyone else to do the same. We also have a very aptly named person called Sustainability who's got a question. So how about we start with Kate and then move on to sustainability?
Yep.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Tim. That was really thought-provoking. And after a long day of meetings, it was good to sit and listen to that. As you might expect from me, I've picked up on your last slide there, where you had the call to substantially restructure or rethink transport governance. And I'd like you to, if you would, say something about what you see as being the most important change that is needed there, that might admit more testimonial and hermeneutical justice, for example, and that might lead to fairer outcomes and this is probably quite a Europe-centric aspect to it, in transitioning energy demand for transport downward, and thinking spatially for different types of towns and cities, but also rural areas.
Yep, that's a really good question. And when I was making that final slide, I wasn't sure whether to include it or to drop it, because I was thinking I'm bound to get the question you're asking, but it's a very important one, and thank you for it. What I would say is that actually, in my experience, at least in the UK, at the local level, there is a much greater openness towards other ways of thinking about transport, other data, other types of knowledge. In fact, the project I briefly mentioned about EVs and on-street charging infrastructure in Oxford, we got the...
You've gone silent, Tim.
Sorry about that. I'm not sure what happened. It's a spontaneous... spontaneous
It
action.
wasn't censorship. Please keep keep going.
Yeah, but what I was saying is that at the local level, at least in the UK, I think there's a lot more openness, and in recent years, for more qualitative forms of data, different types of concepts about behavior or about transport. So different types of knowledges. And I think that is something to build on and to cultivate. Unfortunately, for the national level, I'm much less optimistic. I think it's much more difficult there. The reasons for that are not entirely clear. I think there is definitely something there with, at least in this country, the very strong position that the Treasury has and the kinds of methods that they impose on other departments and the way policy gets made in other domains. But at the local level, there's a lot of potential there. And I think what is really good in transport planning is also that we see a new generation of transport planners, younger, more diverse in terms of gender, in terms of ethnic backgrounds, wider range of experience. And I think that's positive. So I think we do see change happening. But as always in transport, things take time. It just is not going to change overnight. It's like it was moving, sort of changing transport planning, transport governance is like shifting an oil tanker. It's sort of, it takes a lot of time to get it onto a different trajectory. But there are definitely positive signs there.
Yeah. What do you think about the regional level, the sort of trend towards the sort of metropolitan authorities sort of trying to gain some kind of economy of scale and overcome some of the boundary issues at the smaller level? Do you think they're taking with them the local benefits or responding to the national level constraints that you referred to?
I think there is actually there is potential there as well, because what you see at the regional level, there's no real capacity there. There's no infrastructure, no knowledge infrastructure. So what you see is that it is. I have to be careful. What I know of my experience in Merseyside, for instance, and what I've seen in Manchester and in the Midlands, and what we see around Oxford is that it's the big cities in those regions that the knowledge that is created there tends to dominate what happens at the regional level. And these are also the places where I think there are the biggest openings for thinking in new ways, in different ways about transport and behavior and systemic change. So I think that's a positive.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Kate. Great questions. We've also had a question from Edward. That's one I can answer. He asked whether the slides will be accessible, and the answer is yes. And we'll put them on energy.ox.ac.uk. And now we have the chance to hear from sustainability themselves.
Oh, sorry about that. It's Jake Backus here. Hi, Tim. Hi, Philip.
Hello.
Yeah, it's my work, one of my work email addresses, and that was like just sustainability for Seacourt, the most sustainable printers. If I was going to make a plug for them, my question is I feel sometimes we don't get social justice when it comes to transport planning, often because it seems that because as you have outlined and suggested, it's a lot about following the money, following what's new, following technology, and actually the most innovative solutions might be in the past, or they might be around bicycling or cycling. Cycling is my thing, as you know, because I've thought about it for so long that the solution to everything is more active travel. But to what extent are we not able to make socially just solutions and to move forwards to have a sort of decarbonized socially just, affordable, accessible transport solutions for cities. One, because transportation is seen as a sort of siloed, separate concept, and outside of economy, health, and all those other kind of things. And when that happens, to what extent have those cities that have taken change quite quickly, rather than the Dutch model, which has been over sort of many decades, those quick decisions have happened because there's been somebody with some sort of executive holistic power, like a mayor, to see the big picture, to do a social, a solution which works for everybody, and then to sort of move forwards in that way. So then you can say, okay, maybe Bogota, I don't know if they're still doing well on their cycling strategy, perhaps not. But what those cities that have moved forward very quickly is because there was a holistic view, and it was seen as good investment rather than, oh, it costs too much money, we don't have the budget for it, etc.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I'm going to address it in a slightly roundabout way. There is a paper I have been wanting to write for a number of years, and that is about policy styles in UK transport planning. Because I think there is something unique about the style of policy making, especially at the local level in this country. And it's not meant as a fierce criticism from yet another continental who knows how to do these kinds of things, but it's just based on observations and research. And one of the things that I find peculiar about British policy culture when it comes to transport is the strong belief in champions. And what you're talking about with mayors who have executive power is to a large extent about that. And figures like Chris Boardman reinforce that kind of approach. And I think that is useful up to a degree. It allows you to get things moving, but it's not enough to move beyond a certain point. I think you will need something that is much more structural, much more embedded, which is kind of the more continental style approach that you would need. So I think what you really want is that champion to be able to put in place a set of durable institutions that then sort of, when that person leaves, remain intact and allow for further growth. I am, however, not sure that is happening, because another important aspect of the way policy gets done in this country is that financially, there's a lot of what we call start and stop funding. You get a bit of money, and then a program comes to the end, you have to go out and get new money. It's very difficult to do the kind of long-term, medium-term strategy that you would want to, for instance, build a robust cycling infrastructure. This is not something you do overnight. That's a process of at least 10, maybe 20 years. Because of course, it's not just the cycling, the hardware, the physical infrastructure. It is also about creating that broader culture where cycling becomes so self-evident and walking becomes kind of the default mode of transport in a city. That requires much more than physical infrastructure. It's an important part of it, but it's not the be-all and end-all of it.
Because I'm wondering if we don't actually have the right way of making decisions, we don't have the right governance infrastructure to make these decisions, because it's just built in that we can't actually consider, health, economy, social justice, low carbon and environment, diabetes, cancer, all of these things all together, and then it's complete no-brainer to do the right thing. But we just, for some reason, we can't make those decisions in that way, whereas maybe in the continent they can take a more collaborative cross silo approach. I don't know.
Well, everywhere in Europe you see policy silos, and the effects of silos that allow this kind of synthesis that you're talking about, that I was trying to get at, towards the end of my talk is difficult to produce. But what is also challenging in the UK context is the above average extent of centralization, where actually at the local power, despite all the talk about devolution, it's actually very difficult to do something. You always have to go back to Whitehall for all sorts of things. It's still a very centralized structure. On top of that, we've come out of a prolonged period of austerity. So capacity at the local level has been hollowed out, despite the positives that I mentioned previously in my response to Kate, which I do believe are there. There is also a bigger question about capacity and how that has been diminished. If you just realize that as a result of austerity politics, on average, some 25% of the budgets for transport at the local level have been cut over the past decade. How on earth can you then sort of put in place the conditions for a rapid transition to a significantly reconfigured transport system? There's not even enough money to maintain what is currently there to a standard that is more or less acceptable. So there are huge questions about governance of transport. My take on this is that it's in the domain of governance that the biggest challenges lie. It's not the technology or even the economics of it. It's really the governance where the biggest challenges lie.
Right, gosh, yes, and we have to rise to a climate emergency at pace there. So
yeah,
we've got, thanks for that, Jake, great. And we've got two more questions from dear colleagues of mine, Tina Fawcett and Noam, asking about the whole framing, and Noam is interested in the fascination with the new. So Tina, do you want to go first? We can't hear you yet, in case you're trying to speak.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Oh, how exciting. It's good to start every meeting with that question, isn't it? Thanks a lot, Tim. I thought that was really interesting, and it's really, important to think about. I was just wondering if you thought there were any dangers in the just transitions way of thinking about things, in that, arguments about low income losers, let's say, to any type of change or policy can be used to sort of mobilize against change, which primarily affects high income losers, let's say, and we know this, we've seen this a lot. And so it's not that, is finding the best way to defend what the intention of using the just transitions framework is, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a very tricky terrain, particularly where it comes to economic instruments, and the whole yellow vest phenomenon is a very good case in point, where at least at the start, one of the major drivers was about the extra taxation of fuels, where especially people outside of cities where there is hardly any alternative to driving were being hit very hard, which then culminated not only in all the protests, but also in a broader political debate, which kind of makes the implementation of that kind of measure in the French context challenging for a number of years to come. So absolutely, there are risks. But I hope that with more nuanced understandings of justice and forms of justice, concepts of justice that really not just simply focus on questions of distribution, but that take that element of recognition and the epistemic aspects of justice serious, I think we can prevent these kinds of things that you're talking about, these risks obstructing positive progressive change. This is one of the reasons why I think it is so important to work with sophisticated and diversified understandings of justice. That won't be easy always in public discourse, but I think we should definitely try, and I think if we do it well, we can win that argument.
Excellent. Tina, happy? You're muted if you are. Shall we move on to Noam and your question about our fascination with the new?
Hi, thanks, Phil. Yeah, and thank you, Tim, for this fascinating talk. So yes, I'm fascinated with the fascination with the new, I guess. I mean, I guess I was wondering if you could say a bit more about that. Is the fascination with the new limited to technology, or maybe technology and business models, but not any more change? Because on the other hand, you mentioned about being open to thinking in new ways, which actually is maybe only happening more at local level. And I'm just wondering, is there any mileage, so to speak, in trying to present other knowledges or other types of data from other parts of the world as the new to help it gain traction? So a bit of a philosophical question, maybe.
That's an interesting thought, but let me start with the first part of your question. What I call the fascination with the new is not just technology. It is sort of really thinking. I think we should really think here in line with the work on social technical transitions that you and I are both fairly familiar with, and that is sort of the combination of technology with business models, with particular ways of governing all of this. So a classic case would be the platform abilities, the digital platforms that are being used, whether that is for ride hailing, whether that is for dockless bike sharing, whether that is for other forms of mobility service provision, where it's exactly about the combination of the business model, the technological means, and particular ways of regulating and governing and pricing transport that make it such an appealing concept. Learning from across the world is very important, and I think is actually essential, which is why I do believe there is mileage in engaging with non-traditional ways of thinking about transport and mobility and movement. And I have written about this on several occasions about the importance of decolonizing how we think about transport and transport knowledges. I don't particularly like the term decolonizing, but I also cannot think of a better equivalent. But I think that is important to do. So yes, I certainly agree with that. I would not necessarily frame that as a new way of thinking. I think I would rather prefer the terminology of non-traditional or alternative. Because some of that thinking is not necessarily that new. It is only new to the context in which it gets inserted. So, yeah, I think, yes, we definitely need to learn more from different cultures, different traditions.
Somebody's got... Anne, can you mute people? Brilliant, thank you.
Yes, I do keep an eye on it, yes.
Thank you.
Sorry, I now lost the thread of my sentence, but I think I make my point. Thank you for the question, though.
Thank you.
Yeah. Noam, you're happy?
Yes, thank you.
Great to see you, and thank you for that question. And then we've got one more question. This is the point where I realized that my list of questions I won't be able to get in. So we've got Tia next, and also just to let you know, for those interested in the chat, Pietro has posted some very interesting looking links for some further information. Tia, do you want to ask your question to Tim?
Yes, it's a bit of a vague question in my head, so apologies for that if it doesn't quite make sense. But I was wondering where the kind of responsibility lies for moving towards a kind of juster future when you think about transport that inevitably crosses regional boundaries. So I used to work for Dyson on their electric vehicle project, and almost everybody would drive to work. And a lot of people would drive from Bristol to a different county in Wiltshire, which obviously causes traffic issues in both Bristol and Wiltshire and excludes anybody who doesn't drive from actually taking up employment there. So where do you think responsibility lies in those cases for practically moving towards better solutions, juster solutions, and a more sustainable future between companies, councils, different counties, and the national government? And I guess there's also a question in my head about the kind of intersectionality there with other issues, such as who is able to take up employment for certain companies, and what that means for these issues.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't know enough about the specifics of planning in Wiltshire and or the Dyson case and why they ended up where they are based. But what we often see is that these kinds of situations are the consequence of local authorities competing with one another for jobs, essentially, or for employers, and sometimes depending on the geographical context. Also, there's a taxation argument, income from taxation that plays less so in the UK context, but certainly in others. So there's a question here of misaligned or absent coordination, and the absence of a strong planning framework to guide these kinds of companies into specific locations. So this is a coordination. This is a shared responsibility between local, regional, and national government. But employers also have a role in this. Again, I don't know about Dyson, but many employers, many organizations do have mobility management as part of their organizational apparatus. And it's usually not a main task or a main part of their operation. But if it is present and if it is done well, it can have a tremendous impact on the transport situation of employees and visitors, and correspondingly the burden that transport creates in terms of on the environment, for instance. And actually that kind of very personalized approach focused on particular employees and groups of visitors is tremendously effective. It is very cost intensive because you have to do it sort of really, it's really about personal relationships, about personal activity. So it's very time consuming, but it's extremely effective in terms of trying to get people to change their behavior. And if you have a strong planning framework and you have sort of a system of best practices in place, and mobility management is something that is really being cultivated within organizations, you can create a different situation. But again, it is very difficult it's challenging to put all of this into operation. But there are examples of companies that do that much better, also in the UK, organizations that do that better.
Thank you very much, Tim. I thought that was a very well formulated question here. Thank you very much for that. Thank you for all your questions. Have been excellent. And Tim, thank you for your really thoughtful and detailed answers to each and every one of them. And a really fantastic talk at a very high level with exactly what we were hoping for, quite a different perspective from the very often technically framed discussions around transport. So that was fantastic. Thank you so much. That leaves me to say, if you like, you have rich pickings here to write a blog. So anyone is welcome to summarize the key points of today's talk and get in touch with Anne, who will happily make that available on the Energy website. We're getting lots of thank yous flying in for you, Tim. And then that leaves me to invite you again next week, in the spirit of the broad range of topics that we cover here. Next week we'll have Stuart Hazeldine, and he will talk about the creation of carbon storage markets, which I know there are a lot of strong proponents for that in our school and elsewhere. So you'll be welcome to join us again next week on Tuesday at 4 o'clock. Make sure you register on energy.ox.active.uk. Lots more thank yous coming in. And I'll just add mine to that. Tim, this was fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your questions and your interest. And yeah, good luck with the next seminars in the series.
Thank you, Tim. And thank you, everyone. And I hope to see you again next week.